So in an age in which technology is advancing really quickly, and in which we need to know more about what the futures of those technologies will be, and we especially need to know more about how to make technology human-centered. Human technology futures is an incredibly important thing to be doing. So we're lucky today to have a speaker, Genevieve Smith, who is she founded the Responsible AI Initiative at the Berkeley Artificial Intelligence Research Lab, which conducts multidisciplinary research on topics of responsible and equitable AI. She is a research fellow at Stanford University and also serves her at the UC Berkeley Haas School of Business on responsible AI. She completed the Oxbridge circuit, having gotten her PhD at Oxford and then also being a member of a center at Cambridge. She's also done, before she became a PhD student and got her PhD, she's done work for over a decade researching topics of economic empowerment and inclusive technology, including with UN Women and the International Center for Research on Women. Her research has been published in places such as Big Data and Society, and has been shared in articles in Nature, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and the Economic. Research has also been shared at leading conferences, such as the International Conference on Machine Learning, the ACM Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency, and the Society for the Social Studies of Science. So please welcome today our first speaker, Genevieve Smith.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today and kicking off this fantastic series of events, Human Technology Futures Department. Today, I'm going to be talking about what gets encoded, AI, inequity, and alternative technological futures. As we all know, AI is being built rapidly and embedded in everyday decisions, work, and life. Across domains and modalities, the same pattern emerges. Inequity is encoded as a neutral default. So this talk is about that pattern, how it happens, and how we can build AI differently. Thank you very much for the introduction. I am a social scientist in computational social science, PhD at Oxford. I'm a research fellow at Stanford and founded the Responsible AI Initiative and teach here at Berkeley. And my research is really focused on examining the impacts of AI on inequality and how we can build more paradigms for AI technologies. I work and collaborate at the intersection of social science and core AI. And that combination is what I believe makes this work, what this work requires in many ways, and also what makes it possible. I founded the Responsible AI Initiative at Bayer to bridge the social science core AI research, to help bridge core AI research and social science and advance responsible and equitable AI. So we conduct a variety of different research and publish scholarship, as well as do different types of industry impact programs, and then build infrastructure and new models. But today, the question that I'll be at all of you is around in what way do AI systems encode, replicate, and enforce norms and social hierarchies? We're going to be answering that question through three separate studies. The first on discriminative AI systems, specifically focusing on machine learning-based credit assessment tools and their impacts around gender. This draws on my background in science and technology studies and interpretive social science and mixed methods. And then the second part of the talk, I'll be focused on generative AI systems, looking at linguistic bias in large language models and gender bias in text-image models. This is research from the Responsible AI Initiative and some collaborators here in the audience. And then finally, with how might AI be developed to produce more equitable outcomes by introducing ideas around co-creating alternative futures, different types of data set and machine learning development, and also fine-tuning and re-releases. So my talk is really grounded, and a lot of my research is really grounded in theory. Specifically, that technology is not neutral. It's not developed passively, and it's produced from specific socially and historically situated standpoints. So the social context of technology developers really matters and influences design choices and decisions. I also draw on Ruha Benjamin's default discrimination, which highlights that technologies encode existing social hierarchies as neutral defaults, which result in the perpetuation of existing inequalities and discrimination. Benjamin also highlights the phenomena of do-gooderness, where social impact framing of expanding access or doing good can provide moral cover while leaving power hierarchies intact. So diving into the first study around gender machine learning-based credit assessment. So this is really in the air. Some of these on the screen might be familiar for you all, the idea that AI can be used for good. It can be supercharge sustainable development, transform education, advance wealth, productivity, et cetera. A lot of the narratives that we're seeing. And one of the biggest applications of AI in this for good space, especially in low and middle income countries, is AI to enhance financial inclusion for people who are unbanked and underbanked. And the idea here is that people who have access to smartphones can get credit scores through non-financial alternative data and increase their access to finance. This is a very large and growing market. It's valued at nearly $11 billion globally, has expected annual growth in approximately 26% from 2024 to 2031. And to give you a sense of how large this is in certain countries like Kenya and India, in Kenya, nearly 80% of Kenyans have taken out only digital loans, and these types of tools have grown in popularity fivefold since the 2020 pandemic. So how do these tools enter the phone in pocket and download an app? They're essentially assessing your ability to repay, how much money you have, and your willingness to repay. How trustworthy are you? And they're looking at various types of data and features that are on your phone. So things like if you're traveling to and from the same place every day, that might indicate that you have a stable job. They'll look at your SMS, things like financial transactions, any sort of financial records, your works. Are you friends with other people who would be considered creditworthy? They'll also assess your willingness to repay, your trustworthiness. So they might assess your psychology and linguistic behavior, look at things like what kind of apps you have on your phone, and even look at your photos. All this is fed into a machine learning model that assesses what's correlated with repayment behavior and creditworthiness, and then when new come to the provides a credit score and loan decision in terms. The thing about these types of tools is they're very hard to assess. Many types of discriminative AI systems and hiring, lending, et cetera, are very hard to assess because they're closed models and they're often protected through intellectual property. Research is fairly thin. While we do know a lot about pervasive bias that exists in AI and machine learning, when it comes to alternative-based lending tools, a lot it's in computer science, looking at novel models and data that can be used to assess unbanked people. And from an economics perspective, it will look on what are the welfare impacts for people who do get access to loans. From a social science perspective, it tends to be more high-level theory terms like data colonialism, as many of these companies are based in the West. But there's a lack of research around how these active machine learning tools are built and experienced, the power and bias therein, and more broadly around gender impacts within the AI for good space. So this is the first in-depth sociotechnical study of machine learning-based credit tools in low and middle income countries, advancing science and technology studies theories of bias, gender, and situated knowledge. So I asked, do machine learning-based credit assessment tools by fintechs reinforce or mitigate gender and equitable access to finance in low and middle income countries? What are the gender disparities and that exist in the access, outcomes, and experiences of these tools? And in what ways do the underlying logic, design choices, and management decisions of their creators embed or challenge gender biases? So the two methods, the first really looking at access, outcomes, and experience. I conducted a case study in Kenya with one of the largest fintechs in the space through a user survey, as well as text analysis of approximately 200,000 reviews scraped from Google Play, the Google Play Store. This is really important to understand user voices, especially in closed systems. The kind of lived experience can help us better understand the real-world outcomes of these types of tools. And then secondly, the next question around underlying logics, design choices, and management decisions, I studied the fintechs themselves to understand what are the logics that go into how these tools are created. Now, this is known as, this idea of studying up standards of technologies is seen as really critical in studies of algorithms and power because it helps us get to the quote unquote ground truth around how models are assembled and the logics therein. So diving into the first one, as I mentioned, this was a study done with one of the largest active fintechs that has over 12 million global users and over 3.5 million in Kenya. They've dispersed over $7 billion in credit. So it's quite a large fintech in this space. My first finding is that less women access the technologies to begin with and need more help. Women represent about 40% of users, and they need more help and experience greater challenges when it comes to downloading and using these tools. over 2 times more help than, they're more than 2 times likely to need help compared to men. Secondly, I find that they get lower loan amounts, and also rural women in particular have more rejection. Women report smaller loans throughout the distribution, and the gap is largest at the bottom, so entry-level loans. And rural women are over 5 times more likely to report not receiving a credit loan offer, controlling for age, education, marital status, income, digital and financial inclusion. This differential treatment is not explained by legitimate risk factors nor repayment behavior. And the final finding is that these tools actually are delivering a lot of positive benefit for those who do access them. They're intimate expressed by both men and women, and the greatest amounts of benefits I find amongst female entrepreneurs in particular, which is partially mediated by the fact that they don't have other loan options. As one woman said, "It gave me a sense of security and hope when I almost lost hope to live." These tools are in places that are incredibly economically precarious. In Kenya, only 18% of the population is not living paycheck to paycheck. So these tools are providing a way to deal with emergencies, education, support businesses, et cetera. So women are included, but on unequal terms. They face greater barriers, receive smaller loans, and rural women are more likely to be excluded from loan offers. After mediation analysis, controlling for repayment behavior and other variables, these gaps remain. But those who do get access report positive benefits. The fintech that I partnered with on this on the survey, these results prompted them to an internal audit, and they confirmed the bias that I found, and I'm now working with them for additional data analysis and fairness interventions. So the second question is around the underlying logics, design choices, and management decisions, more about the why and how this is arrived at. So how these tools are created is at a high level, there's a recognition that underbanked people are left out of financial folds because there's discrimination that exists, market inefficiencies, and smartphones and machine learnings open new opportunities for financial inclusion that didn't exist before. And there's 2 core mindsets that underlie these tools. The first is this American banking mindset, that creditworthiness is not just about your wealth, but about your character and trustworthiness. And this idea of creditworthiness is actually very American. In the late 1800s, the idea of creditworthiness was seen not just as something around familial wealth, which at the time that's how it was in the UK and other parts of Europe, but it was this idea that anyone could lift themselves up by their bootstraps, really tied to this idea of meritocracy. It was also seen as an art, something subjective. You could take into consideration race, gender, marital status, et cetera, by loan officers. In the 1950s, these 2 men, Bill Fair and Earl Isaac, turned the art of creditworthiness into the automated credit score. Now, the time was very controversial. Credit officers didn't think that you could actually take something that was this art, subjective art, and turn it into something that was automated. But it's taken off, and the credit score is an export of the United States. In places like Kenya and India, credit scoring is actually a fairly recent phenomenon. So this leads to these algorithms that are essentially predicting your ability to repay and your willingness to repay. The second core mindset that underlies these tools is the idea that data is the truth and we can leave it to the machine. As Dante says, something that we know, for instance, if a customer has 12 apps in the finance category, they tend to be more riskier. Oh man, if I can remember all my quotes. They tend to be more riskier than somebody with less than 5 apps in the finance category. Now, how to explain it from a psychological point of view, behavioral psychology point of view is kind of challenging because we really leave it to the machines to assess information value. And Amir says, "I always believe data is the truth. Data will never lie." This is accompanied with being purpose-driven and profit-motivated. As Chris says, objectivity, real is execution. That's my mantra. If we execute well, can we make money doing it? This leads to a tool that where fairness is pursued by being unaware to different demographics. And that there's a gender, quote unquote, blind approach whereby gender and other demographics are not considered or assessed. As Sarah says, because we're using gender in any of our scoring models, everyone's coming on at a very level playing field with everyone else. You don't have to think at the back of your mind, what if? But this leads to a lack of grappling with the ways that data, features, and proxies and access to the technology itself are gendered. Gender can be learned. There's gendered variables related to income, employment status, and sector. Women tend to face higher unemployment rates globally. They're more often in the informal economy. And because of caretaking norms, they spend more time on unpaid care and part-time work. Kumar says, we don't train them on gender, but then there's a lot of correlated variables when you look at gender. Income is one of them. But more than that, the sort of employment segment matters a lot. And just like patriarchy, they're kind of learning that men are better to give loans to over time. Obviously, we want to be equitable, right? But the typical black boxes. So it highlights how there's a tension here that's complicated by machine learning being considered a black box, whereby even the developers don't necessarily know why an output was arrived at. As Prashant says, at a technical level, you know that can still happen, which is not avoidable. It's a preference towards a more stable segment. So the overall picture is that we have this American banking mindset where these models are predicting ability to repay and willingness to repay, or how trustworthy someone is. And they're learning from gender norms that have gender differences. And then it's also combined with the Silicon Valley mindset of data is the truth, and we should leave it to the machines, which why the best way to be fair is to be blind to gender, which leads to a lack of grappling with data, features, and proxies, and access to technology itself are gendered. So the overall picture that's reported is that there's gender differences in who accesses loans and loan sizes. Less credit goes to women, about a 33% gender gap in Kenya and sub-Saharan Africa, up to almost 60% in India. But there's a key tension in all of this, which is considered to be better repairs and observed to be better repairs. As Dante says, there are some local rules that apply globally. If you are a woman, you're a better repair than a man, full stop. So why then do fintechs think that women are getting less access to loans, but at the same time, they're actually having better repayment behavior? There's demand side and supply side factors. On the demand side, less women have access to the apps. They may choose to or select lower loan amounts, and they can face greater challenges using the apps. On the supply side, they recognize that proxies and features, especially for ability to repay, have gender differences. Applying a socio-structural lens to this, you can see how these are all shaped by gender norms and systemic inequity. Less women have access to the apps, which is linked to gender digital divides. Less women choose to apply or select lower loan amounts, linked to gendered household financial decision making. And there's also gender differences in financial literacy and digital literacy, challenges using the app. Meanwhile, the proxies and features that are used can also be gendered. But there's one more factor here, which is that fintechs also are optimizing for lifetime value, which is how much revenue a certain person can make over their lifetime with using the app. So what's happening here? The median of the algorithm is smartphones. The models are predicting and using certain features, and there's certain optimizations that are happening. These are all choices. These are all choices that have gender implications. Access to smartphones is gendered, algorithmic features that are used are gendered, and profit priorities privilege certain end users. So women get fewer loans and lower amounts, even though they're observed as better repairs, highlighting both a market efficiency and a potential discriminatory effect that we also see through the Kenyan case study. Still, fintechs assert that there's varied interpretations of fairness that reveal their ethical frameworks, which support and uphold the choices that they make and legitimize the gender differences. This idea that they leave it to the machine and profit and scale results in different understandings of fairness. Fintechs talk about fairness from a process perspective. Being unaware is what makes it fair, and actually delegating to the machine is what makes it fair. They also highlight fairness in terms of inclusion or access for all. By being inclusive, we're being fair. They also highlight fairness from an outcome perspective. It's fair because it's having social impact, or it's fair because it's accurate. Rakesh says, the way we look at fairness is that it's open, the system open to anyone. It's a free-to-use app by anyone. And Jack puts it, if financial inclusion is the goal, it's fair because it's reaching people who are underbanked. But unawareness is best, ignores how data and models are gendered, and benefit maximizing, ignores that inclusion does not equal equity. And accuracy brings up a new question, which is what exactly is being measured when it comes to accuracy? Creditworthiness can be seen as a self-fulfilling prophecy. The types of terms that you get can dictate whether or not you're able to repay that loan. Fintechs reveal that they're using they're using a certain metric that's revenue centered called equalized profit, whereby women's reliability can be undervalued and men can be overextended. So they're essentially measuring risk or measuring accuracy according to making similar levels of money at different risk profiles. Each of these enables inequity to be encoded, but makes it look legitimate under different fairness frameworks and ethical frameworks. So bringing all this together, embedded logics are encoding inequity. There's this paradox of algorithmic objectivity, where treating algorithms as neutral conceals the embedded logics and power hierarchies that are in them. This concept of encoded gender norms that I offer, whereby algorithms are encoding gender norms via gender data and features, which can impede the evolution of gender norms over time. And this idea of rhetorical ethics, where ethical frameworks are used to legitimate the technology, but rarely embedded into the model architecture evaluations. And there's this accuracy smokescreen where fairness reflects what I call situated priorities, which are epistemological positioning and institutional logics. And accuracy through a profit lens can actually penalize women's reliability. And finally, there's the limits of self-regulation. These market-driven logics of scalability, profit incentives, and expansion reflect companies operating as you would expect. Companies have responsibilities to their shareholders, but it's also co-opting ethical narratives and the limit of for-profit actors to self-regulate in these domains. So taken together, the underlying logics around creditworthiness, the ability to repay and the willingness to repay, the idea that data is the truth and machine is our objective, and fairness being unaware, inclusive, and accurate leads to design choices where gendered features are used, not tracked. Fair would be via unawareness, scale, and these ideas of accuracy, and management decisions of prioritize profit and inclusion as opposed to equity, resulting in models embedding these gendered features, being gender blind, masking the differences, and fairness perspectives and profit priorities, privileging male-coded behaviors and rationalizing the differences. So while fintech innovations hold promise to support access to finance, they fall short for gender equity. Learning from gendered features in the tool itself, they learn from gendered features while the tool itself are not equally accessible. They optimize for lifetime value and measure accuracy through the profit lens that can penalize women's smaller loans and reliability. And creditworthiness encoded as male can be defended as ethically sound, highlighting that the promise of meritocracy has yet to be achieved. So seeing how these neutral defaults manufacture inequity and credit, I questioned whether this was unique to fintech. And this led me to examine defaults and bias in large language models and text-image models. So moving on to looking at generative AI tools. This is work with collaborators here at Berkeley, and understanding that English has over 1.5 billion speakers globally. The vast majority of those speak quote-unquote standard varieties. And when it comes to disparities in AI performance for different language varieties, they can result in restricting access to service, increasingly as more large language models are used to provide access to different services, and impose additional linguistic burdens on already minoritized communities. So this was the first large-scale audit of ChatGPT across 10 varieties of English. We wanted to understand how the behavior and performance of ChatGPT differed in response to different varieties of English, and what harms, if any, responses exhibit towards speakers of minoritized varieties. This builds on an understanding that dialect discrimination is a long-standing problem. It's often used as a proxy for racism, classism, xenophobia, which has been documented in schools, the workplace, housing, and courtrooms. Within large language models, we've seen research looking at African-American English speakers facing more stereotypes, higher hate speech misclassification, and performance gaps in a range of natural language processing tasks. And there's some research on disparities for other varieties, but it's generally understudied. So we tested 10 different English language varieties using various corpuses. And our methods looked at 1,000 responses across these 10 different varieties. For the performance question, we annotated the responses ourselves using linguistic features. We had a linguist on our team that identified linguistic features of the 10 different varieties, and we analyzed the inputs and outputs for the different linguistic features. For the harms, we had native speakers evaluate each variety across a range of positive, neutral, and negative metrics. Native speakers are really important to evaluate this because people who can best understand the types of stereotyping and discrimination that their particular identity goes through. So at a high level, we find that linguistic features are retained for standard varieties, but significantly less for others. So standard American English has nearly 80% retained. And you can't see the number, but for Indian English, it's 15%. So there's a very large gap between these standard varieties and these other varieties. Among these minoritized varieties, the retention rate roughly correlates to estimated population. We also see that there's a default specifically to standard American English. So while linguistic features maintain for standard British English and standard American English, the orthography or the spelling highlights that to American English in particular. The non-standard varieties also perform worse across a range of metrics, nearly 20% worse when it comes to 25% worse in terms of demeaning content, 15% worse in terms of condescension, 9% worse for comprehension, and 8% worse for naturalness. And when we had the model imitate the particular language variety and the native speakers evaluated that, stereotyping increased and comprehension worsened further. We offer a theoretical contribution to this space called Standard AI-Generated Language Ideology, which builds from understandings in sociolinguistics around standard language ideology and offers a sociotechnical framework to understand hierarchies around certain language varieties, especially standard American English, that are positioned as the normative, appropriate default mode of linguistic production, despite all varieties being equally valid. So what's happening is they're not merely reflecting power asymmetries, but AI technologies are reproducing and legitimizing them as technologically neutral. And we developed a taxonomy which illustrates how this operates in 4 different ways. Through legitimation, what is considered default, or where the quality discrepancies are, through stereotyping, appropriation, and erasure. So this trend of neutral defaults manufacturing inequity exhibit models. Does the same pattern exist in other modalities, looking at images? So I go to our final study around gender bias in text image models. This is also with collaborators here at Berkeley, Bayer, and also in Europe. So synthetic images are used in everyday applications, advertisements, and presentations. They're also used in training data for foundation models. And as the proliferation of synthetic images increase, so does their power to influence society and also to reinforce implicit stereotypes about people. So we ask, what are the identities generated by these models, and do outputs align with real-world diversity? And to what extent do model outputs incorporate stereotypes or quality discrepancies across different genders and also nationalities? There's research that looks at how generated images tend to depict women as younger, especially age gaps being higher in high-status jobs, and women tend to be sexualized in synthetic images. Research also shows gender and racial bias in occupations, with these occupational representational biases amplified beyond real-world statistics. But a lot of this existing research tends to look at automated assessments with limited intersectionality and focus more on on occupations. So for this, we looked at nearly a million images across 22 countries and 4 state-of-the-art open-weight models. For looking at default gender identities, we prompted the models with a range of occupations and activities that were equally, according to real-world statistics, fairly equal for men and women. We did automated image assessment to understand kind of what gender outputs were across these range of occupations and activities. And then for performance and harms, we selected 20 prompts in particular, and 7 countries. And we had people who matched and then we did gender neutral prompts as well as gender specific prompts. We could say a firefighter, an image of a firefighter, or a female American firefighter. For the gender specific prompts and nationality specific prompts, we had people who matched that identity, assess that image across a range of metrics. So we had here would be a firefighter, and this is a Brazilian female firefighter. So our first finding is that neutral prompts output 70% of the time. And this is actually amplified in countries with higher gender inequality. So unfortunately, you can't see the top right, but that's nearly 77% of countries in high and very high gender inequality compared to the mean of 69%. We also see that this male default becomes especially prominent within high power occupations. Whether they're high power occupations that are dominated in the real world by women or men, the model outputs men. Here, the darker blue are the occupations, and on the y-axis is the AI male output, kind of the rise of high power occupations towards the top. And on the bottom left here, we see more of the low power occupations staying female if they already started as female. The second finding is that their highest quality of synthetic images is of men. So and it's lower naturalness and quality when it's prompted for pictures of women. So on the top right there shows men and male-dominated occupations have the highest quality, followed by men and female-dominated occupations. And the lowest quality is women and male-dominated occupations. So there's this counter-stereotypical penalty. Then we also see lowest comprehension for non-binary people and among low and middle income countries. Third, we find those stereotypes for men and women across nationalities. Women are depicted as thin, attractive, smiling, and young. Men are serious, fit, and muscular. You can see this in some of these images here on the top. We have a trade broker of women across different nationalities. They're smiling, attractive on the younger side. The Brazilian woman's in a tank top. We're not sure if she's working or in a cafe. Hard to say. We have the men, which look more serious, fit. They are all kind of working on technology or have paper or pens in their hands. And then in prompting non-binary, on the bottom, these images look very similar to the male images, except now the men are smiling. Yeah. And on the top, we have some unclear whether the prompt was understood. The Egyptian non-binary trade broker does not seem to have matched the particular prompt. So bringing this all together, what's happening here? There's an encoding of societal gender logic. Findings reflect ingrained gender logics where male is the default, this idea of androcentrism. Male is the default for neutral prompts, which gets further amplified in high power occupations, and there's highest quality for men. And then we also see this gender polarization and stereotyping, a hypermasculinity for men and femininity for women, as well as this counter-stereotypical petty of quality from a quality perspective. And then there's erasure outside the binary. Non-binary prompts fail at comprehension. This isn't a bug, this is a pattern. Bias can be understood as policing. Norms are encoded and enforced via stereotypes. Men is more creditworthy or serious, muscular, smiling, young, and attractive. Minoritized language varieties as stereotyped and demeaned. Who and what is the default? Male is the default. Standard American English as the global standard for language. Quality discrepancies. Woman is lower quality. Non-binary is ineligible. And other varieties outside of Standard American English as less accurate, lower quality. So how is this happening? First is this belief in the objectivity of technology leads to unquestioned tools that are encoding dominant patterns, norms, stereotypes, training data, and model processes. The black box conceals the mechanism, and opacity ultimately protects the status quo. And narrow definitions of fairness obscure structural inequality and legitimize the. So why does this matter? It matters because these technologies, these black box technologies, can be learning from and amplifying and projecting inequities into the future in ways that are hard to spot. And what can we do? Maybe more data is the answer, not necessarily. Maybe being fair is the answer, ideally, but what does it mean? It's a normative and loaded and political choice. So really, the message in this talk is that data reflects the world's inequities and choices that shape AI, what data to use, what to optimize for, what counts as fair. They're not neutral. Technologies encode dominant norms and hierarchies by default. This isn't a glitch. It's a predictable outcome of uncritical design, but design can be done differently. Across these studies and the work that I've done with public and private institutions, here's what I've learned about how to do this. The first is to start with people, not the technology. It's not just what we can build, but why do we want to build it and what problems are we solving? Second is to center affected communities as designers and decision makers, not merely participants or receivers. Third is reframing fairness towards equity. Fourth, building differently ultimately requires building together. And by building together, we can do what can't be done alone. From the social sciences side, we understand why the world works as it does, how it's impacted by and impacts technology. We understand power, context, and meaning, and human decisions behind AI. On the CS and engineering side, on the right, it's understood how to build, test, and deploy, the technical rigor, and measuring impacts at scale. But in the middle, by building together, we can navigate ethical complexity in AI. We can develop systems that are equitable and technically rigorous, and ultimately have AI that advances flourishing and shared futures. And again, that's what the Responsible AI Initiative is really founded to do, bridge the social science research to advance responsible and equitable AI through various scholarship, through industry impacts I mentioned, through playbooks, frameworks, large-scale intervention, different infrastructure and models like data sets, model development, and co-creation. Within these tools in particular, there was different types of social impacts and infrastructure developed. The fintech study resulted in audit by the fintech company, and now I'm working with them, as I mentioned, around accessing more internal data and fairness interventions. Those have prompted different ways that USAID conducted their evaluations for providing grants. And I also worked with USAID to inform their global AI research agenda, building from this work. Within the large language models research, been highlighted in places like Nature, and the text-to-image models work is now informing a new data set where we'll be fine-tuning the open weight models that we assessed. So ultimately, the research agenda I want to share with you all social implications of AI and alternative technological futures. We can and develop new pair technology by collectively envisioning technology futures, co-designing new models, data sets, tools, and frameworks, using methods like participatory and speculative design and co-creation. At the same time, we can investigate algorithmic biases, harms, realities, and the mechanisms. We have to understand the problem in order to be able to solve it through evaluations, but also studying up to understand the logics and underlying mindsets behind technologies. This is a sample of some of the work of the Responsible AI Initiative and some of my work. There are peers and collaborators in the audience, and thanks for all of you for being here. And many of these have also led to tools, data sets, and different models. I want to end with two projects I'm really excited about that we're working on now, like how we can do this differently. The first is around a new data set that we're creating. This builds from the gender bias and text-to-image models research that I mentioned. We're creating a data set of 40,000 images globally in the 7 countries that we had in our initial evaluation of diverse lived realities and counts across different genders. We asked to what extent can fine-tuning with counter-stereotypical data mitigate gender biases. So we'll be fine-tuning and re-releasing the open we had in our evaluations. And then secondly, we also asked how might we build data sets that are aligned with data feminism and democratic principles, so that data sets are not extractive, but can actually be empowering amongst people. And so from this data set, we'll be creating a living data cooperative as in partnership with the Mozilla Data Collective and drawing on participatory data governance theory and practice. The second project I want to mention builds from the fintech research and looks at participatory design and AI for her credit. This research asks, how might machine learning-based alternative lending tools be developed in ways that center women's voices, needs, and values throughout the design process? We're working with Village Savings Lending Association in Uganda and in partnerships with local universities to define what these groups, which are already informal savings and lending groups that are distributing loans to their members, how they define creditworthiness, reliability, and fairness. And then we'll be co-designing with them a machine learning tool to help them become more visible to financial service providers on their own terms to enhance more access to finance. So we'll be developing this machine learning model as well as a Gen AI interface to support explainability and financial literacy education. So in conclusion, is not a norms and power hierarchies are encoded and enforced via stereotypes, roles, defaults, quality discrepancies. And we believe in objectivity, unquestioned technologies, narrow fairness, and black box opacity. But we can imagine and build it differently, starting with people, centered communities, reframing to equity, and building together. And I believe we can do it here at this university, at this college, and at this time. So thank you.
So you're building this data set of images that are counter-stereotypical. How do you see that approach compared to just like explicit prompting? Like you tell the prompt, you've seen the whole world. Could you maybe like what do you think about the effectiveness of those two?
Yes, I love that question because we've certainly thought about it, and I have another student here all in the audience who we're working on what are the different types of bias mitigation approaches here. And certainly I think prompts and prompt injection are a popular method. I would say that can be considered more political. And I think that is the difference with building a different data set that actually represents diverse lived realities, right? These are real people, real images doing different things. And it's really more about having the model learn from those diverse lived realities as opposed to kind of like prompting it internally. And I think, especially in the current political environment, building from lived realities can avoid some of those political questions. But yeah, that's the thought.
So clearly, as you said, the biases are built the data that have been used to train all the large language models. But all the frontier companies do fine-tuning into feedback. Do you think that fine-tuning phase actually enforces gender bias or works against it,
That's a really great question, and also one that we have been thinking about as well. To what extent is kind of and it depends, I think, too, on enforcement learning. People might not necessarily recognize the different stereotypes that exist, especially if it's different kind of identities that they don't necessarily understand. And so while it could potentially help, it's not necessarily, I would say, like a fully bulletproof kind of method. I didn't have the time to walk through this, but I did want to mention, we had another study that was trying to understand like more around for occupational representation bias within text-to-image models, how much of that training data versus say RLHF or model architecture or fine tuning. And we did find in this particular study that 60 to 70% of that representational bias was directly attributable to the training data, but it also highlights then that there is kind of other areas where maybe there's bias still entering, and perhaps it's through RLHF and fine-tuning decisions, but we don't know for sure. Good areas for future work.
But one question I have is that women have less loan, even though they're more likely to pay it back. Is it clear that the credit part or credit there's not paying back? Or sometimes we might look at things and make more profit if they give me a loan and they don't pay there's more on my credit card that have more on the house. As maybe they said, loan to make more money.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's basically through optimizing for things like lifetime revenue and measuring fairness and through a profit lens, then they could be undervaluing women's reliability and also overextending men as well. And so it's necessarily, but a lot of the fintechs that I've talked to about this, they don't really realize, that. And many of the fintechs, if they're in this space of themselves as being for good. So they do want to support social impact, but they aren't necessarily doing these kind of like evaluations and understandings and thinking about the ways that profit priorities could actually be inadvertently penalizing reliability for some groups and overextending others. So that's certainly something that comes up in addition to some of the other reasons. The fintech that I'm partnering with, they are interested in, they recognize that there is kind of this inefficiency that's happened and that women are actually one of their target markets. They realize that they're like women are better repairs, but they're not giving them as many loans. And so I'm working now with them to better dissect and understand that. But there's this tension, which is ultimately companies and they're operating towards profit priorities, then that might be in their best, which again goes to show that there's a role for regulation. I think there's an idea that, certainly if technologies are better than the status quo, like should we be using them? And I think because these technologies, I do find, of course, I didn't go into the details in this short presentation, but I do find that people who are outside of financial folds are indeed getting access to finance through these tools. And so it is going aside from discrimination that exists in many lending institutions, and it's avoiding some of the traditional inequities that have existed in these formal financial institutions. But at the same time, it's replacing some aspects of bias with others that we're seeing through the different ways of those differences in terms of less women have access to smartphones, the profit priorities can penalize their reliability, and those features can result in differences. And so it's still resulting in not an inequitable current reality. And the challenge is, even if it's slightly better than the status quo, it could still be kind of projecting into the future the solid state that exists today in a way that's harder to spot and solve for over time because it's in machine learning black box tool that's harder to kind of open up and understand. So it can impede progress towards advancing equality, if that makes sense. I think it's a really hard issue. With a lot of these tools, like especially with just different discriminative tools like hiring, lending, et cetera, they're incredibly hard to conduct research, especially credit worthiness and credit scoring tools, because you don't understand what are the features. Like companies aren't public about their training data. They're not public about the features that they're using for credit worthiness, all these types of things. So it's incredibly hard to actually assess these and given the diversity that exists like in the real world. And that's why I think that algorithmic auditing needs also of approaches for these types of tools. So understanding kind of user surveys, digital trace data from users can be helpful. And hopefully that's enough to get you into the inside of the tool to understand more, which is why I'm really excited that the fintech, from my research of kind of from the outside, they're now allowing me to come into the inside, which is great. I think that's kind of like ideal. Enough research from the outside to get the firm to open up the black box, the model and the data, then that's ideal. And then in addition, I think we could more around studying how they're creating that, setting up for the logics and understandings. And that's how you understand the different ways that like profit is prioritized and some of the ways that fairness and ethical frameworks are embedded into these tools, which I think is really important to know how they kind of sustain. I love that question because I think it's such an important one that goes to, you know, ultimately like who gets to decide as well. And, you know, what we see in the models currently that they're kind of real world statistics. So I think we could all agree that we should at least be matching the real world statistics, not amplifying beyond it. But then there's the question of, should we be pursuing equality? Is it around parity? And ultimately, it's a normative choice, right? And I don't think that, I think as a researcher, from my perspective, it's more about, it's not one that I am equipped to answer, but rather how can I create processes of co-creation or community engagement, participatory design, where we can think about how to adapt that in perhaps more localized versions of the model. But I think it's a really tricky one, and it's one that we'll be facing because we're going to be fine-tuning open models with this data set. So what are the decisions that we're going to make? Probably be around reflecting the world as it exists. But again, that's a normative choice, and I think we need to just be really clear about that. And it's one that I think is difficult to struggle with, but to at least to acknowledge the tension and complexity. But I know that's what you think about too, so I'd love to chat more about it. So I would say, and this is drawing from background in STS and feminist STS in particular, but I think that by pulling on more of an ethic of care approach, of reframing fairness towards equity from an active, and then reframing fairness from a process perspective towards more being community-centered is one way to do so. I actually wrote a paper about this, so I would be very happy to share it with you. But I think it's a really tricky question, because again, it's normative, it's political, but there's some, I think within like the feminist STS space, there's some kind of areas that we can follow and explore there. Okay, thank you so much.